Hi, welcome to the Bathtub. This is the old masturbator, and we're talking to this today. I'm trying to resurrect all my old theme shows because I forget what they were. And one of our theme shows is the All Bathtub Hall of Fame. We get this incredibly prestigious and expensive award, which someone gave me years ago for nothing, and it's a special award that we only give to really the best bathing buddies, the best books to take to the bathtub. And the ones basically totally solipsistic, personal, selfish bathing pleasures, which for me would equate to someone who I've been reading all my life, off and on in the bathtub, which is Shirley Jackson. I thought we talked a little bit about Shirley Jackson. And first of all, let me say this is a facsimile of this award, basically a photograph. Will go to anybody who's surviving members of Shirley Jackson's family who would like to add this prestigious award to their mantelpiece. Thank you, Shirley Jackson, for your wonderful stories, and this is the award that you received. And I wanted to focus on, I'll talk about a bunch of things about Shirley Jackson. I was sort of inspired to talk about her because there's a new movie out. I can't remember if it's at the theaters or it's probably on Hulu or something. It's got Elizabeth Moss, which is based on Shirley Jackson, and I'm sure it's really well made and all that stuff, but everything I saw about it just kind of annoyed me. It didn't sound like Shirley Jackson at all. It sounded like, they wanted to show how terrible her husband was or something. And it was based on this really good biography by Ruth Franklin, which, some people, some hack critics like to use it was all about how her husband ruined her life and stuff like that, which I don't think that's not a fair summation of what this book is about. It's a very good biography. It's very, very appreciative of a very good writer and a complicated woman and a complicated relationship with her husband. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed this book. If you want to read a good biography, this is a good biography to read. I'll put a link to my piece I wrote years and years ago. But this new movie that came out, which I have not seen, so I know nothing about it, except that it seems to be about everything about Shirley Jackson. Nothing that I'm interested in seems to be in this movie. So I'm much more interested in this kind of writer, lived at home. Seems like a fairly claustrophobic personality. And she writes about very claustrophobic people. Probably Americans in the 50s, where this kind of sense of anonymity and conformity and being stuck at home with the kids and loving being stuck at home with the kids and at the same time being kind of horrified by being stuck at home with the kids. And Shirley Jackson writes really, really well about the kind of horrifying underlying realities of conventional middle-class life, particularly in the countryside. She writes the lottery. Everyone gets together and brings their pizza and their sandwiches to the local party, and then they stone some woman at the end. That is an affectionate and unaffectionate picture of the world that kind of terrified Shirley Jackson, and which she found incredibly funny. That's how I read her anyway. She wrote a lot of books. I want to talk about a few things, and I want to focus on The Lottery, a collection of stories that she collected in her lifetime. Really important, the single author collection, the collection that the authors put together themselves, much more useful to a good reader than a collected edition of Shirley Jackson, which is available, I think, from Library of America. This is another collection. This was posthumously put together by her husband, called Come Along With Me. On my Kindle, I have An Ordinary Day with Peanuts. That title story, it's a posthumously collected bunch of stories by her children mainly. I think her husband was dead by this point, and it has the title story, An Ordinary Day with Peanuts, is one of my all-time favorite Shirley Jackson stories. So it's good for that case. There's a good reason to get that, but I'm going to argue that if you read one collection of Shirley Jackson, you really should make it The Lottery, Adventures of the Demon Lover, that she put together in her lifetime. Okay, so there's this posthumous collection by her husband. I have not read The Sundial, but I want to read this in the bathtub soon. And she's best known for these two late novels. The Haunting of Hill House. The Haunting of Hill House is based on the famous old house, the Winchester Mystery House up in San Jose, I believe. And she was from California originally, and then went east and lived pretty much out in the countryside, New England countryside, most of her life. But she was from the West Coast, And that picture is kind of misleading. It's from a great movie. The Robert Wise film of Haunting of Hill House is really good, but it's actually a lot funnier. This makes it look just terrifying. It's pretty funny, and I have to say that if I sum it up, the basic premise is that there's this place of horror that has its own kind of living presence, and there's a woman who basically decides that she wants to live there the rest of her life. It's much better than being outside in the world. And the complexity of the characters, particularly the central woman, is a terrific piece of writing. Here's a book. I've always lived in the castle, and I reread all these 4 years ago when I reviewed the Shirley Jackson biography. This is a book that every 14, 15-year-old girl when I was a kid seemed to love this book. And it was read in high schools. It was often assigned in high schools, this very edition, in fact. And I had never read it until 4 years ago. And it's a terrific book. It's a Gothic novel, and there's a supernatural element in both of these books, by the way. And it's about two sisters, and I don't want to give you too much more than that. And frankly, I forget most of these books by now anyway. But I really enjoyed reading it. And she really gets into again, claustrophobia is a big element of everything Shirley Jackson writes, and at the same time, a comfort of being in that claustrophobic environment. So you can sort of, that one split in the Shirley Jackson personality seems to be in all her work. Finally, what I wanted to say was, I'm having a little bit of wine here. What I wanted to say about Shirley Jackson was, I read her off and on for years, particularly her short stories, and one of the things that was interesting is I thought, well, I would just do a brief piece about Shirley Jackson, and I picked this book up, which I had read a couple times over my lifetime, and as I was reading it, I couldn't put it down. I mean, I basically read all the way through this thing, and I made a few notes of stories that I particularly liked, but I still, again, she wrote a lot of short stories. She wrote a lot of short stories for money, so for a lot of the women's magazines. And she wrote for The New Yorker was one of the biggest places, but a lot of the women's magazines. And she wrote a lot of stories that she wasn't particularly thrilled with, that she wrote for money. And they were a little more slick romance type stories, I guess. And every once in a while when you're reading through her work, there was a lot of these kind of mildly okay stories that just don't have that real punch of a really good Shirley Jackson story. This book is nothing but the good ones. So when you get the collected stories of Shirley Jackson, you get a lot of these kind of slightly uninteresting stories. This is a terrific story, one story after another. I wanted to just give a couple of quick descriptions. First of all, there's some elements of supernatural events in those last two novels of hers. Her stories rarely, if ever, that I recall, have supernatural elements in them. They're much more about this kind of dissonance between particularly women, middle-aged women with families whose husbands are never around, and their sense of the unreality of the world they live in. They all surprise you. They do not have that. At one point, I started to think, well, they're like kind of Twilight Zone stories. They're not at all like Twilight Zone stories. They don't tie up that tidily and that neatly, and they're not that gimmicky. They're really, really well-controlled experiments in disturbance, being disturbed. And by the time you finish one of her stories, you're disturbed and you're laughing, I would hope. Those are the two things you should be doing. The first story, The Intoxicated, in this book, is this amazing story. And it's her stuff, she writes a lot about the kind of horrors of the 20th century, in the 1950s, when you're really looking down the barrel of nuclear Armageddon, a nuclear apocalypse. And this story called The Intoxicated, it's almost like a Cheever story about a kind of drunk guy wandering through his friend's middle-class home, and he runs into his teenage daughter, who is just really not happy with the world. And she writes, she sits around and tells him how she's obsessed with the end of the world and how the world is going to come to a conclusion. And she says to this guy, I keep figuring how it will be. Somehow I think of the churches as going first, before even the Empire State Building, and then all the big apartment houses by the river, slipping down slowly into the water with the people inside. and the schools, in the middle of Latin class maybe, while we're reading Caesar. She brought her eyes to his face, looking at him in numb excitement. Each time we begin a chapter in Caesar, I wonder if this won't be the one we never finish. Maybe we in our Latin class will be the last people who ever read Caesar. So this kid is talking about the unsettling nature of being in schools, trying to prepare for the future when there may not be one. It's pretty current. Most of the stuff is pretty current. The second story, The Demon Lover, this is a very typical story of this collection. It's about a woman waiting for this boyfriend of hers to come over to take her away to get married. And she's sitting around and he doesn't show up. And she goes inside to go looking for him. And she doesn't really know where he lives. And she starts to realize she doesn't know anything about this guy. And she starts to follow somebody and ask people about this boyfriend of hers. And they start sending her in different directions. And she thinks she's learning about this guy. I don't want to give you any more than that. But that sense of the comfort and the expectations of your life and going beyond them and seeing that there's nothing out there is a recurring story in her work. There's another one I love. Oh God, the one like my mother used to make. It's about a control freak who has this perfect apartment and his girlfriend across the way who's a slob. I think it's one of the best stories I've ever read in a long time. Like mother used to make. He fixes dinner for her. And I don't want to try to describe it. Trial by Combat. I'm going to give, there's another sort of the neighbor, talking to the neighbor and being a little disturbed and a little reliant on that neighbor. There's also a story in here about the rural life called The Villager, which is about a woman whose dog has this big dog. At the beginning of the story, she's with the kids. There's lots of disturbing kids in these stories. They're very funny and disturbing little witchy kids. There's a story here called The Witch, which is absolutely brilliant, 4-page story. And she's the neighbor calls and says, "Your dog's killing my chickens. And if you don't do something about it, we're going to have a dog killed." And this woman is trying to deal with the home and the family and the husband. The husbands are always gone. They're never around. And she's trying to figure out what to do. And she goes around town asking people, "Well, what do you do when your dog kills chickens?" And people tell them of these horrible things that they do to dogs. One guy says you tie a dead chicken around the dog's neck. Another one says you get spikes in a collar and you show the dog a chicken, then you pull the spikes, gets its throat. And this woman, as the story progresses, just hears one horrifying story after another about how you stop your dog from attacking chickens. I don't want to tell the endings. They're not surprise endings, but they are really crushing endings. And when you leave the end of that story, it just reverberates in your head for quite a long time. I don't want to describe too many more. If you don't know The Lottery, you can get it free online, and you have to read The Lottery. Shirley Jackson is deserving of the All Bathtub Hall of Fame. Her short stories are terrific. There's not a single bad story in this or a single bad sentence in this book. And those last two novels are still worth reading from my recent reading of them. So I would really strongly recommend her. If you watch the movie, I would take it with a grain of salt. I don't know anything about the movie. I don't know how soon I'll watch it. And I would definitely advise reading this biography. It was a really good book, taking on the difficulty of writing biographies of writers is that they're not very interesting. The writers just sit at home writing, And Shirley Jackson's life was not particularly interesting, exciting, or anything like that. But she wrote very well right up to the end of her life. And she died very young. She died, I think it was late 40s, which is a shame because she had a lot of good stories left in her. And she seemed to be hitting her stride as a novelist, which is quite sad in a way. Okay, happy bathing. I'm going to do another one of my favorite writers, another weird writer, Doris Pasurkia next. And I'll probably do that in the next day or two. But for now, Shirley Jackson, All Bathtub Hall of Fame. The highest honor you can receive in the bathtub is this award. There's nothing higher than that award in my bathtub. Okay, take care.